Black Lives, MABL, a division of the ICNA Council for Social Justice. Imam Khalid has lectured extensively both nationally and internationally. He is the author of A Brief History of the Islamic Party in North America and wrote a chapter in the book Muslim Minorities in the West by Smith and Haddad. Now I'd like to welcome Imam Khalid to start the program. Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Sisters, it is truly an honor to have this opportunity to talk to you about one of the more pressing unresolved issues, and that is of racial sensitivity here in the United States. It's very unfortunate that in the young history of this country and over 240 plus years, that this issue has still not been come to any kind of workable, appreciable solution. And so we want to just take a few minutes of your time today to talk about racial sensitivity and American dilemma. And I am very hopeful that you will get something from this. I'll start by giving a definition of what is actually racial sensitivity. Racial sensitivity in the North American context refers to an awareness and understanding of the experiences, perspectives, and issues related to race and racism, mainly as they affect racial and ethnic groups. Now, this definition is a definition that we are applying specifically to the North American context. So we're talking about the United States and Canada. And while migration is a global phenomenon, this discussion will center around North America generally and America in particular. Racial sensitivity. I'm sorry, one second here. Racial sensitivity. I'm sorry, my having a slight technical problem here. I can't see the full slide. One second, please. Okay. Okay, let's, I'll try to work through this without actually seeing the slide. And racial sensitivity is recognizing and acknowledging the physical and systemic inequities that marginalize communities based on race or ethnicity and actively working to challenge and address these disparities. So in order to bring about a consciousness of racial sensitivity amongst individuals as well as a mass and group consciousness, we have to first recognize and acknowledge just what is this racial sensitivity is all about. What does this really mean? And in order to understand the concept of racial sensitivity, without knowing or recognizing, we have to understand exactly what this means. In the United States, of course, we've had the epidemic of just racist attitudes towards people of color, in particular in the United States. Racial sensitivity can be understood in other places around the world, of course, in places like in India, where you have a caste system where it's very defined, even though it may be illegal because of the historical presence of a caste in the country of India. The residue from the legality of this institution is still in place. There's also, as we look around the world, we can see in places like in Palestine today that there are citizenship categories that are placed upon people in occupied Palestine, whether they're living in occupied West Bank or whether they're living in Gaza. And these categories entomb the citizens in this part of the world in occupied Palestine. It entombs them to have certain benefits and denial of benefits because of the system that is in place. Each country has a unique historical context that leads to the present. But in this case, we're talking about how being racially sensitive, that we have to first recognize that because of these inequities, that you cannot have racial sensitivity as long as we're having all of these different issues and elements in the society that are not being actively addressed. And I want to talk just for a moment about the impact of the United States being a settler colonial state on the past, the present, and the future attitudes about racial sensitivity. We have to understand first what a settler colonial country is all about. And oftentimes, and most of the time, we do not look at the United States as being a settler colonial state. But it's very much so. So when we look, and maybe it will help us put this in some kind of context, then when we look at countries like Australia, when we look at countries like New Zealand, and we see how people of European descent historically moved into these areas and supplanted the indigenous populations and imposed their will, not just by might, but by the cultural structures, by the government, by the outline of what goes on to a day-to-day basis, that Australia and New Zealand are also settler colonial states. And then we look at places like, of course, as we mentioned, modern day Israel, how it's very clear how this is a settler colonial state. And then I'll give just one more example, and that is the historical nature of South Africa, the country of South Africa, when it imposed an apartheid system on the indigenous population there in South Africa. And the majority of the tribal representatives under the system of apartheid, of course, were the Zulus and the Xhosas. And even though before the advent of European settler colonialism, these were the paramount tribes. They were the individuals, especially in certain parts of the country designated now as South Africa. They were most influential. They were those who were controlling so many things in the society until this advent of individuals and groups of Europeans coming into their nation. And so when we look at the United States, it's very easy for us to look historically, look at the history of this nation, and see that America, or what we know today as America, North America in particular, was not devoid of people at this particular time. And so when Europeans came into the land now known as Canada, and here in the United States, what's designated now as the United States, there were indigenous people that were living here from coast to coast, from east to west, from north to south. So when the colonial powers, particularly those of France as it relates to Canada for the most part, and the Spanish in the southern part of now the United States, and in the northern, northeast, and middle segment of the country, colonized by the British, we get an idea about how these settler colonialists, how they transform the very nations and the lifestyle of the people who were living in these areas. A type of political entity that emerges when a group of settlers from one territory establish a permanent presence in another territory, typically replacing or marginalizing the indigenous populations, is what we have in the United States and what we have in the country of Canada. There are, and settler colonials are different from just colonizers. Colonizers, for the most part, do not attempt to permanently settle and transform the land of a people who were living there before they got there. It's mostly an attempt to exploit the resources. How can we take advantage of the indigenous population and take their resources for the enrichment of the countries and the areas from which we come? But so settler colonialism is much different. I'm not going to say, in many instances, it is a much harsher form of colonization uh, because of the displacement, because of the dispossession, and because of the marginalization of the indigenous populations. Now, what are some of the impacts that this might have on the past, the present, and the future attitudes about racial sensitivity? In order for people to be colonized by another group of people, in order for this colonization, this settler colonization, to win approval by those who are coming into a different area, and to try to win approval by those who are given favors by the colonizers, there has to be a process of dehumanization of the indigenous population. You cannot uh, garner support for settler colonialism unless the process of dehumanizing the individuals who are there at the time of the settler colonization occurs. And so what we found in Canada, what we find in Canada in particular, that there were indigenous, Native American, first world individuals who were settling all across the now country of Canada, that these people, in order to justify their being colonized by people who were appropriating their lands and by people who were marginalizing them from the society and from the resources, a process of dehumanization had to take place. In the United States, when this area was colonized by settler colonists, what we find that happened, that of course the indigenous people of this land were the first occupants of this country we now call the United States. But when the British and when the Spanish moved into these areas, they found people already there. But what they recognized was that they might control those indigenous people through their technologies, but there still needed to be a dehumanization process that took place. So these indigenous people, who often had very sophisticated societies, those who were not living the plain indigenous people, who were constantly moving around and traveling over the landmass of this country, but those who had settled in communities we find in North and in South America, and we're focusing on North America, we find that very complex social arrangements were garnered and were developed in these sedentary communities. But those who were colonizing the people, the settler colonizers, came in and said that the people were savages, that they had nothing that was worth saving, that the best thing that they could do was to be at first be slaves to the people, to work the land because they knew the land, because they had lived there for so many thousands of years, literally, that these people knew how to raise crops. They knew the changing of the climates, of the weathers, of the seasons, and these kinds of things. So at first there was an attempt to say that these savages can only help us grow and build our society. Later on, when the settler colonialists, the British and the Spanish, realized that this newfound land was so vast that they needed a lot more people to work the land than what they were accustomed to, then there was the start of the transportation of enslaved Africans, the this hideous trade of the enslavement of African people that were brought into the Western Hemisphere, and more particularly in the land that we now refer to as the United States of America. And the same kind of, a similar kind of dehumanization process took place when these African people were brought to the United States in order to work the land, in order to be enslaved persons. And even though the initial enslaved persons by these settler colonialists were indigenous people or American Indians, the nature of people who lived as freely as they lived, and even their physical conditioning was not, it was not the best for this enslavement. And so I'm not trying to say that any one people are better suited to be enslaved by other people, but the physical dexterity, the ability to work with under the conditions that chattel slavery brought into existence, the people of African descent were brought into the United States, physically kidnapped and brought into this landmass. And just like the Native American people, the same attempt to dehumanize this population, to have them seem as if, in the case of people of African descent, that these people are so despised and should be so despised because they don't even have a soul. It's no way that you can even appeal to them with religious doctrine because they don't have a soul. And so the dehumanization of people of African descent was more extreme than it was, and that attempt, and in actuality, it was much more extreme with people of African descent than it was of the indigenous population here in the United States, or this area of the United States. And what has happened from the time of the virtual genocide of indigenous people in this country and the forced importation, and perhaps importation is a misleading term when we're talking about the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. So it wasn't really an importation, it was a kidnapping, it was a force by violence and death, a forced bringing of people of African descent into the Western Hemisphere, and more particularly here in what is known as the United States. So what happened? There were so many commonalities, common aspects of the exploitation of this indigenous population, as well as the people of African descent. But perhaps the most common was that their lives, that their humanity, although they may be acknowledged as some form of human beings, but it was not on the level of the white Europeans who had come to master and to control any and everything, the human beings that lived in this landmass, as well as the resources of this land. And so from the very formation of the nation, there was an attitude that was developed and perpetuated about how non-white people in this part of the world who were either forcibly transported or who were indigenous to the land were inferior by their very existence, by their very nature. They were inferior to those settler colonialists who had deprived them of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so this initial attitude about these populations was perpetuated in order to continue the exploitation. These same ideas, maybe changing just a little bit in the extreme nature, but the attitudes about the inferiority of this human life that was found in the form of these individuals, that this was not something that was anything. This was not anything that could be overcome. That the people were by nature inferior, and so they would remain inferior. Now, as we look at individuals coming into the United States, and I'm talking about coming into this area over the centuries, over the decades, and not just coming in latter times in the 20th or 21st century. But there were other populations that were coming into this landmass of the United States. And of course, amongst those people coming, you had individuals who were coming from Asia, different parts of Asia. And when they came into this area, and we can look specifically and I'll just give a few examples about the people who were coming into the landmass of America, who were of Hispanic or Latino descent. Hispanic is a little more narrow identification. It relates more, for the most part, to those who speak the language, the Spanish language. The Latino is a designator that I personally and many others prefer, rather than saying Hispanic, because it includes others who of the same ethnic grouping who may not speak the language, have historically spoken the Spanish language. So when these Latino people were coming into this landmass of the United States, they found that when they came into this country and where they settled, of course, you all know about the masses of Latino people settling in the area that we call Mexico today. But what you may not know is that the settlement of Latino people initially included much of the United States. As a matter of fact, basically half of the United States was once what we now call the country of Mexico. And this large number of people who had moved into the North American context, and even half of the United States, that after the Texas succeeded from Mexico in 1836, and the state of Texas didn't join the United States until 1845. But there was a war that was fought to try to break Texas. It was a dispute over Texas. The Mexican government was declaring Texas a part of Mexico, and of course the United States was saying no, this is not the case. So, but after defeating the Mexican government in 1848, a treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed and established between the United States and Mexico. And it was only in 1848 that the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma became part of the United States of America because Mexico was defeated in a war. And one of the things to keep in mind is that this once huge country of Mexico that had been reduced down to what it is today after 1848 with the signing of this particular treaty, that those Mexican citizens who lived in what became parts of the United States were given the ultimatum that for the most part you had 1 year to leave out of this country, and if you didn't, very negative consequences will happen to you. And those consequences were things that we saw happen to African American people all the way into the 21st century, and that is hanging. There were many Mexicans who were citizens of Mexico when it was part of the United States who were actually hanged. They were tortured. They were burnt. Their bodies were dismembered in ways that we find similar to what had happened to people of African descent. And so the largest today, the largest grouping, the largest minority population in the United States today, people of Latino or Hispanic descent, suffered very similar kinds of abuses and tortures from the white colonial settlers. These settler colonialists, had tortured and abused them. And the same kind of attitude had to be adopted to justify the way that these Latino people were treated, while they were hanged, while they were cut up, bodies dismembered, and these kinds of things. It was the same dehumanization process to say that they are not equal to the white settler colonialists, so you could do whatever you want to do to them. I want to add another point too, to make the point that I'm making about Hispanics and Latinos living in this part of the world in mass numbers. And so it won't be a confused reference that I'm making. That what was going on inside these areas where Hispanic people, Latino people were living was a result of development of an attitude of settler colonialism. We have to understand that the very idea of race is a social construct, meaning that it is something that is man-made. It's not a biological feature. It's something that those who have wanted to establish a hierarchy of human beings, establish the social construct of race. Let me just give you a little bit more history. And that is that when the Europeans came into this landmass of North America, they did not come into this landmass identifying themselves as white. They came here as British. They came to this land as Spanish. They came as French. They came as German. They came as Scottish, Irish. They came as representatives of the country that they came from. They, at this time in human history, they did not identify themselves as white, as a white race. But when the numbers exceeded the ability of these desperate white folks who were coming out of Europe, the number of those non-Europeans coming into the landmass of the United States when those numbers exceeded the numbers of the Europeans, it was feasible for those who were in a minority population, because of so many, ultimately millions of people of African descent coming into this part of the world. It became necessary for their survival to now realize that all of the animus that we may have had on the European continent against each other, this had to stop. And so now we have to come together in our whiteness. Forget about, at this moment, the countries that you've come from. Let's come together around something that we can all identify with, and that is the color of our skin. We come from a certain tribe, and now the tribal grouping was given, the different tribal groupings were giving a name and an identity, and that was white. And so from that particular moment, with all of the indigenous population that for the most part were destroyed by diseases that their bodies didn't have immune systems to deal with, by that indigenous population being destroyed, by so many people of African descent now being forcibly brought here and enslaved, it was a survival mechanism to invent now this construct of race. And so that those who identified as race could now move forward in the control of the population of this wide, expansive country, this wide, expansive area. They could move forward together while subjugating those who did not look like them, who did not share a common language. And I'm talking now mostly about the British dominance over the control and development of the American landscape. And so these are factors that impacted the past, the present, and what we go on into the future about racial sensitivity. It's something that the attitudes were developed at the earliest stages of development. And because of these attitudes, we have similar problems today as it relates to the sensitivity, the racial and cultural kinds of sensitivity. Now, not all, and I pose the question, that all non-white populations coming into the United States, were they all viewed on the same level? No, this is not the case. There were certain populations that were viewed from the very beginning of the formation of this country, very populations coming into this landmass that were viewed from the very beginning with animus. And now this animus was coming together with attitudes developing about as the numbers increase, a kind of racial capitalism was now coming into play. And that first group that had significant pushback because of their immigration to this country were the Chinese. As a matter of fact, up until 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place, became a law, there had never been a law. There was not a law on the book that excluded a population based on where they were coming from. But in 1882, and I say that it was because of a kind of racist racial capitalism that had developed in this country, meaning that those who now identified themselves as white felt that they had the birthright to monopolize the resources and whatever came with those resources, whether it's financial resources, whether it's the resources of land or whatever, that now this attitude of we have a right because these people who are coming are inferior to us, and we as white people have this right. And so this was something that was deeply rooted. So in 1882, with this Chinese Exclusion Act, it was motivated because the capitalists who were living particularly and developing in the West Coast and in that part of the United States at that time view this mass uh, 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 coming migration to the United States by Chinese people as a threat to the economic future of those who were identifying themselves as white by many decades at this particular time. And so this Exclusion Act was put in place. We don't want but so many Chinese to come into this country. Look at what happened. And I give another example. This was when the Japanese during World War II bombed Pearl Harbor. And what happened after that, of course, we all know that many Chinese, particularly in the West Coast, were rounded up and put in internment camps for close to 5 years. Their properties were taken away from them, and they were denied just basic rights and citizenships in these camps. But one thing that is not often acknowledged or recognized or known is that one of the primary motivations for these internments were that there were white industrialists, capitalists, who wanted the land that had been purchased and being developed by so many Japanese. The Japanese on the West Coast on huge farms. And so these capitalists wanted their lands. And so the government, the federal government, was convinced that you can take the land, we'll take the land by taking them off of the land and putting them in internment camps. I'm not dismissing the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but the overreaction that was given to Japanese of American citizenship and others was just that. It was an overreaction, and the underlying reason behind it was what we can refer to as racial capitalism. Now, let me jump a little bit here. When we talk about, do all non-white populations have the same animus or have the same attitude deflected upon them? And the answer is categorically no, it's not. And I'll jump ahead in centuries, and not centuries, but in decades, and look at what developed in 1964 in this country, and this concept of the model minority. This model minority was a label, an identification that was given to Asian people, not from China, right? Not from Japan, but from the Indian subcontinent in particular. And this model minority was this label came about because when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, giving people of African descent access to public accommodations and jobs and these other kinds of things in a modified kind of way, that the American people and those thinkers in this country, the American government, came up with this identification of a model minority, that these are special Asians, or these are special minorities that have come into the country. They're not like those lazy, shiftless Black people who don't want to work. They're not like these people who don't have the academic wherewithal to accomplish and achieve in an intellectual or academic environment. But that group of minorities from Asia, they're special. And we will afford special benefits to this particular group that have been denied to people who have been basically indigenous to the country at the time of the formation of the country. Now, let me move on here. And so the role, I want to talk just for a minute about the role of racial capitalists in the United States and how this impacted racial sensitivity at that particular time and all the way up until today. Racial capitalism is a concept that examines the intersection of race and capitalism. It refers to the ways in which capitalism and racial hierarchies are intertwined and mutually reinforcing. In the United States, racial capitalism has historical roots in the institution of slavery and the exploitation of Black labor for economic gain. It created a foundation for the accumulation of wealth that persists up until today. And so you have examples of this like sharecropping and the desegregation of people of African descent and others, redlining, drawing lines on a map designating where non-white people, particularly Black people, are able to live, discriminatory labor practices. All of these things have traditionally, historically impacted the attitudes that individuals have about non-white citizens, particularly certain populations of non-white citizens in this country. On the screen here, we have a saying by what many of us consider perhaps the first martyr for Islam, not going back to the period of enslavement, but in modern times, the first martyr of Islam here in the United States, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. And one of his expressions was that I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then criticize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. And oftentimes, I think this is a kind of, if it's an unstated mantra, this is an attitude that many who have a certain degree of social consciousness develop this same kind of disgust for individuals who victim blame, to look at people and understand historically and to the present day the kind of inequities and injustice that they suffer from, and then turn around and point at them and try to penalize them or denigrate them because the weight of what has been placed on them, they have not been able to stand up tall completely. And Malcolm was also has been quoted as saying that you can't have capitalism without having racism. What I've tried to develop the thought and the idea up to this point is that there in the United States, in Canada, there is the intersection of capitalism with racism. And that intersection has allowed a certain segment of American society, or those who are in the controlling areas of American society, that these are people that because of this intersection, they are forever excluded from having full inclusion in the just freedom to of education, of financial institutions, of determining where they live, and these other kinds of things. So let's, in the interest of time, I'll move to the next screen. And these are just some expressions, of course, that we find in the Quran, and we find in the prophetic traditions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in the interest of time, I ask that you read what we have on the screen there. I won't do a lot of commentary about what you see, but it's very clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it very clear for humanity all the way up until Qiyamah that no human beings were created superior to one another, that no human being, just by their birth and who their parents were, is more noble or better. No groups of people, no individuals, but it's only by our taqwa, it's only how close we get to submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made it very clear as well, even making it clear on what's considered his last khutbah, that there's no superiority of Arab over non-Arab, or black over white, or white over black, and so forth. And another one of my very person that has given me inspiration before I embraced Islam, and inspiration since I embraced Islam, of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, and what he was saying. And I think this speaks to a phenomena that we see across American society today. That one thing that I want to make clear: as long as whites show me respect and recognition, and that same respect is not shown for every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. American society has always allowed the special people from groups to move up in the society, the kind of special Negro syndrome, to allow certain individuals to accumulate wealth and be entertain people, and this kind of thing. So I move now to the most important part, and I'm sorry to have spent so much time in this other discussion. Unfortunately, let a lot of time get by me, but these are some tools on how to build racial sensitivity, inclusivity, and how to foster allyship. And I'll quickly try to read through some of these and make some comments. That first, we have to, if we want to break the cycle of what has been so skillfully woven as a social net to inhibit individuals from living up to their full potential, we have to first educate ourselves. This is why so much time was spent on the history, to get an understanding. Don't go for just what you may learn in civics, in U.S. civics. We have to educate ourselves, take the initiative to educate ourselves about the experiences and what goes on in marginalized communities, to listen and learn, listen to individuals from different racial and economic backgrounds through workshops, seminars, community events that address racial issues. Reflect on bias and privilege. Don't think for a moment that there are not still in place certain social barriers that have not been removed for certain groups of people in this country. It's not trying to make an excuse for those who are not showing initiative and doing what they can, but understand by reflection and by knowing that there are some who are given certain privileges that others are denied. Speak up. This is very important. Challenge racial stereotypes and discrimination whenever you witness it. Be a voice to advocate for racial and social justice. It's not just enough to just say that I don't have prejudicial ideas about other people who don't look like me. That's not enough. We have to challenge ourselves, even within the Muslim community. We have to challenge racial stereotypes and discrimination when we hear it, when we see it, when we witness these things. It's incumbent upon us to not just passively sit and listen to a brother who's very dear to you, or a sister who's very dear to you, express racial or prejudicial attitudes. That has to be a kind of speaking out, as we are commanded in Islam to do. Build relationships, form meaningful relationships with individuals from diverse racial backgrounds, engage in cross-cultural interactions, and build connections based on mutual respect and understanding. This building of relationships is something that sometimes can be challenging because of maybe where we're living, maybe where we are worshiping, maybe where we are socializing. That what we find is that we may be running in the same circles. We are our sphere of relationships is very narrow, and it's narrow because of the physical proximity that we may have to people who are not in the same income bracket or same racial or ethnic group that we are part of. But so we have to go the extra, make the extra effort to build these meaningful relationships, engaging in cross-cultural interactions and building connections. Use your privilege. If you hold privilege, use it to uplift marginalized voices and create opportunities for others. Use your platform, resources, and influence to advocate for change and support underrepresented communities. Many of us have privileges in American society that we may not even consciously acknowledge, because it may have become so commonplace and even an expectation that certain privileges would be afforded to us, that we don't recognize that we have what we have because of privilege, and that we should use the privilege, if that we have it in any area, to uplift marginalized voices and help to create opportunities for them. And then the continuous learning, racial sensitivity and allyship require ongoing learning and growth. Stay informed about current issues, social movements, and evolving conversations around race. You know, there's a mindset amongst a number of people that I get so tired of hearing people talk about racial issues. Just let it go. Why keep talking about these things? Maybe if you focus on something else, then maybe these issues wouldn't exist. But it's quite the opposite. We should never tire as Muslims of watching instances of discrimination or racial insensitivity. So we have to be in a continuous learning process. Let me just give one quick example from the lifetime of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I want to give the quick example of the life of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari. Abu Dharr al-Ghifari was perhaps the fourth or fifth person to embrace Islam after the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abu Dharr came from a tribe, that the Ghifari tribe, that was known not for their business ability, but they were known that they got whatever they needed for their tribe by robbing caravans, by taking whatever they needed for other people. I read something where it said that in this Ghifari tribe, they didn't even have a market, because everything they needed, they would go out and steal and take from other people. But Abu Dharr was not like that. This was not a part of his makeup. So he didn't engage in this kind of just taking things from others. Abu Dharr was a very well-respected Sahaba of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I say this for a reason. You and I know the story about Abu Dharr getting into an argument with Bilal ibn Rabah, the Abyssinian brother who became the first treasurer of the Islamic State and also the first muadhin of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Bilal and Abu Dharr got into an argument. And while they were arguing, Abu Dharr said, "Oh, you son of a black woman." And he wasn't saying that as some kind of honorific title or identification. He was saying that because of his mental slip, his mental lapse into falling into some kind of predetermined attitude about people of this African, this dark-skinned descent. And so he said, "Oh, you son of an African woman." And it hurt Bilal's feelings, but it also angered him. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ and told Prophet Muhammad ﷺ what Abu Dharr had said. When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saw Abu Dharr, he was very angry. with him. And he told Abu Dhar, he said to him something that was probably most hurtful for someone in this early ummah of the Prophet Muhammad to be told that you still have jahiliyyah in you, that your attitude is something that uh, evidence jahiliyyah. You haven't purged yourself of everything you need to purge yourself of. I say this to say Abu Dhar was a prominent Sahaba of the Prophet Muhammad. He was a brother who was knowledgeable about this deen. People would come to him and ask him questions. He was one that people like the Iranian social thinker Ali Shariati said that Abu Dhar was the first socialist. And he was saying that because of how strongly he advocated for dispersing money and capital amongst the people and not hoarding it and this kind of thing. And so I use Abu Dhar as an example of how it's not just the ignorant, it's not just the unlearned, it's not just those who are trying to somehow be Muslim today and I'm something acting like something else tomorrow, that this was one of the earliest Muslims. This is one of the most recognized pious Muslims. And yet he still, because of how these attitudes about racial insensitivity, that they prevail so strongly in the society, that he himself fell victim to it. So none of us are free from this. And the last thing is this question of allyship. I think this is very important for us to understand. Allyship refers to individuals or groups supporting and advocating for marginalized or underrepresented communities. An ally is someone who actively works to challenge and dismantle systems of oppression, discrimination, and inequality. Even though they may not be marginalized themselves, it involves recognizing and acknowledging one's privilege, as we talked about privilege, and then using it to amplify the voices and experiences of others, advocating for their rights in equitable society. Allyship is not a one-time act, but a continuous commitment to learning, growth, and action. It requires humility, empathy, and a willingness to make mistakes and to learn from them. I apologize in advance for any mistakes that I may have made in this presentation. Anything good that I've said, it comes from Allah. Only the mistakes have been mine. I would hope that we would pay attention to this concept of allyship. And if we have not being a part of that and fostering allyship, that we will start doing that. But also pay very close attention to these tools to build racial sensitivity and inclusivity and these other things, that these are workable formulas, that if you and I first recognize what shortcomings we may have within ourselves, recognize the context in which we are living today here in the United States, the historical evolution of racism and racial insensitivity in this country, that it is deliberate and has been formulated and not just something that spontaneously came into existence. So on that, I bid you assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Khalid. Thank you so much for that insightful and informative talk. Alhamdulillah, like I personally learned so much from it. And I'm sure all of our attendees and listeners have learned a lot from it as well. We really appreciate your time and teaching us on this important and needed topic of racial sensitivity. So Jazakallah khair once again. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and your family. And to the attendees and listeners, please keep Imam Khalid and his family in your da'as. That is an adab, a characteristic of a student to a teacher, that they make da'ah for their teachers and they make da'ah for their families as well. If any of you do have any questions, Imam Khalid has shared his email. So his email is scribe SCRIBE51@gmail.com, and you can directly reach out to him. So with that, inshallah, dear audience, we conclude our session for this morning. We thank you all for attending, and we pray that you not only benefited from this session, but like Imam Khalid said, you continue to educate yourself, you continue to use your voice to stand up for justice, to stand up for the truth, and you implement this knowledge that we have learned and that inshallah we continue to learn. So with that, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for all of our shortcomings. May He accept it from us and grant us the ability to continue to be vessels of truth and vessels of goodness. On this note, let's continue to keep our Palestinian brothers and sisters in your special da'as, and all of the other countries where our brothers and sisters are enduring immense hardship and oppression. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease their pain. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them, have mercy on them, help them, and grant them justice, freedom, and pour upon them from His tranquility. And with that, let us not be of those that turn back on them, but allow us to be those that are there for our brothers and sisters, and allow us as a Muslim Ummah to unite for this cause. So inshallah, with that, I'll end. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.